Hello, welcome to the Quarter to Three live stream for the winner of this week's Request Wednesday, Hearthstone Battlegrounds. This is the auto chess. Is it a mod? Is this official? It's the auto chess version of Hearthstone, a game that's making a lot of money for Activision Blizzard. I have not played it. I've never actually even played an auto chess game. I'm not quite even sure how they work. Normally, we'd find out today. But first, I'd like to talk to you guys a little bit. Here's the world. We all know it. We live in it. If you zoom in here, the South China Sea. Hong Kong, about in the middle of the 19th century, the British Empire was selling them cotton and wool, and in return they would buy silk and porcelain. Uh, Unfortunately, there was a bit of a trade disparity, and the British Empire didn't like that. So what they figured out that they could do is grow opium, grow poppies in India, convert it to opium, and then sell it to China. And this helped them with the trade disparity because otherwise they felt like, hey, we're just pouring a bunch of money into China. We're buying all their stuff. They don't want our stuff. Well, let's make something they want. So they made a lot of opium for them. And that didn't, of course, go over well with the Chinese government. They tried to outlaw it. This is the middle of the 19th century. The British Empire is a huge global colonial power, an empire. So and actually America was part of this. American companies were involved in this. But the Opium Wars, I think there were three of them, were fought. After the very first one, uh, the British Empire said, "Okay, we've won this war," because it was China back then, and the British Empire could just steamroller whoever they wanted. So the British Empire said, "Okay, we've won this war. We're going to sell all the opium we want. We're also, by the way, Hong Kong. We're gonna take that. You guys don't need it anymore. This is now part of the British Empire," and they stuck a flag on it. And over the next 150 years or so, this flourished because if you look, it's pretty straightforward that if you want to do trade with China, you don't want to like go over here and come down around here and then bring it back here. No, you just come up through the Suez Canal, through here, there you go, and bring it back to the UK, Strait of Gibraltar. But it should all, like everything, if you want to get something into or out of China, oh my gosh, not overland. We don't do the Silk Road anymore. Bring it to Hong Kong. This is the gateway to China. And you'll note also smack dab in the middle of Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines. Uh, if you wanted to go to Japan, by the way, it's on the way to Japan. So Hong Kong, over the years, became a flourishing British center of trade. And the UK, I mean, one thing you can say about them that you can't say about a lot of other European colonial powers, they developed their colonies. They wanted to get some infrastructure in. They planned to stay there for a while. But something weird happened, and I'm really shaky on this. I'm not entirely sure about the deal here. In 1898, they went from deciding, okay, we're taking this in perpetuity. They signed a 99-year lease with China. Now, the 99-year lease had something to do with like legal laws about, hey, you can't hit 100 years. It's like when you price something at $4.99. It's not $5, it's $4.99. You fall just short. It's a psychological thing. So there's something legally at work with 99 years. At any rate, Britain was like, okay, China, in 99 years, we'll give it back to you. And then when 1997 rolled around, they gave it back to them. Now, this was after lots of uh, well, so there was a lot of dealing between Deng Xiaoping and Margaret Thatcher. Uh, Unfortunately, the British didn't really have much of a leg to stand on, and China, you'll note, if they just wanted to roll an army in here, they could. So what happened was the UK eventually was like, okay, you can have it back in 1997, but here's the deal. And this was where, so the UK, they kind of wanted to keep it because it was a huge flourishing trade center. There were a lot of people who were basically UK citizens living there. They didn't want to hand it over to China. The people who lived there didn't want to hand it over to China. So during negotiations, a lot of what the UK suggested was, okay, how about we say that you, China, you have sovereignty, we have administration, we, the UK. And Deng Xiaoping was like, no, no, I'm not going to do that. But what did come about was something similar, and this is the case in a lot of diplomacy. Eventually, the idea of two countries, or two, see, even I've screwed it up, two systems, one country. This was a concept that was floated. Macau was also involved in this, to give Hong Kong and Macau back to China. And by the way, Hong Kong. So this little here's Hong Kong Island. This urban center is Kowloon. These are the new territories. And then right over here is where you cross into China. So it's a big old peninsula. And then Macau, come over here, yeah, it's basically, I mean, it was part of the whole deal. As Britain was like, okay, have this back, but here's the deal. You get it in 1997, and you have to promise China, it's part of the deal, you have to promise that for 50 years, the way of life that the people in Hong Kong enjoy shall not change. The system of government will remain the same. You can't go in there and go all Communist Party on Hong Kong. And China was like, yeah, yeah, okay, fine. We're all right with that. And so the handover happened. And you can imagine living in Hong Kong. I mean, 150 years of British rule, for all intents and purposes, it's part of Britain. Um, and imagine living there and maybe raising a family or owning a business, having roots, having stakes here, and knowing that the UK was going to hand you over to this brutal autocracy, a communist country. I mean, this is the Cold War when a lot of the negotiations were going on. Uh, Imagine how horrific that would be. Like, imagine if so we gave back the Panama Canal, right? At a certain point, we were like, hey, Panama, you can have this back, and that was a big deal, but it wasn't as big a deal because Panama was our friend. We had basically cultivated the Panamanian government throughout the Cold War, so yeah, they can have it. We gave it back, and even though there was a little growing pains there, and we had to kick Noriega, right? Yeah, fine. But imagine if the Panama Canal were the Nicaraguan Canal. And imagine that we had to hand it back to the Sandinistas. It was the Communist Party in Nicaragua that we fought against in the Cold War. Imagine that we had to give them the Panama Canal. That's what was basically going on with Hong Kong being returned to China. So, a lot of anxiety, of course. But this deal that was struck, for 50 years they would be left alone. It would be, yes, one country but two systems. There was a sigh of relief breathed by a lot of people in Hong Kong. And sure enough, that's what was implemented. Hong Kong is a separate country. It has its own rights, its own form of government, its own judiciary system. It has its own anthem, its own flag, its own economy and trade policies. It's got a separate currency from China. There's an immigration system. The legal system in Hong Kong is basically carried over from British law. They have a representative parliament. Oddly enough, some of the folks on their representative parliament basically appointed by Beijing, by China. But Hong Kong is its own country. And it's not a thing, by the way, like after the Chinese Civil War, when the Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan. China's just had a real bug up their ass about Taiwan. We, the United States, don't even diplomatically recognize Taiwan. We can't say it's its own country. We, of course, have relationships with them, and with that little patch of the ocean between China and Taiwan, we consider inviolable. But we can't say it's a separate country. No such situation with Hong Kong. Everybody knows, including China, Hong Kong, a separate country. They have someone, the person in charge of Hong Kong is called the chief executive. Right now it's a woman named Carrie Lam. So back in April, uh, Carrie Lam, her government, floated this amendment to Hong Kong law that China would be able to extradite suspected criminals. Now, again, that anxiety that people in Hong Kong must have felt, imagine that. Imagine that law being introduced. And it's not, by the way, when you consider criminals in the United States, they have due process. Being a suspected criminal in the United States, very, very different from being a suspected criminal in China. So if Hong Kong were suddenly to enter into this extradition deal where Beijing could say, hey, that we think that person's a criminal, we want to bring them over to China to subject them to our legal system instead of you guys' legal system, that's opening a door to crack down on dissidents. That's opening a door to suppress journalists. Um, Social activists rightly freaked out at that, and they took to the streets. Hundreds of thousands of them. They were like, no, this is insane. We will not stand for this. And these protests were formidable. So eventually, Carrie Lam says, like, okay, this bill that we were going to introduce, we're suspending that. Not canceling it, we're just going to put it on hold. It's like when a TV show goes on hiatus. Again, it's sort of a verbal game, like two systems, one government. They're kind of keeping it in the wings, but they're not going to pursue it. And the protesters were having none of it. They continued to protest, and they furthermore escalated their demands to five, I feel, very reasonable things. What the Hong Kong protesters want, and this was formulated in the wake of Carrie Lam saying, okay, we're going to just suspend the bill. They eventually decided, okay, we want the bill canceled, just completely taken away. Erase it, tear it up, throw it in the trash. That's one. Number two, we don't want these protests to be characterized as a riot because that's how the police in Hong Kong were responding with riot police. And by the way, the people of Hong Kong, they have the right to assembly. They have the right to assemble. They have the right to free speech. So that was their second thing is you can't refer to us as rioters. We're protesters. The third thing, uh, anybody that you arrested during these protests, we want them free. The third thing, the cops are getting out of hand. We want an inquiry into what the cops are doing. And then finally, let's see, did I get that right? Withdraw the bill. Let me go to my list. Withdraw the bill. Stop calling this a riot. The people you arrested, let them out. Look into police brutality. And here's the big one. They insisted that we have universal suffrage. That means everybody can vote. We have a completely representative government. Uh, and these are the things that the Hong Kong protesters want for themselves in Hong Kong. This, as you know, is still going on. It began back in April. And Carrie Lam, by the way, has since relented on the bill. That was officially withdrawn. That's out of the picture now. That demand was acceded. That was they gave in to the protesters there. And some of the protesters also now are starting to demand that Carrie Lam resign. So the people of Hong Kong who are protesting, and one of the things that happened throughout last month is this is all escalating. The police are starting to use live rounds. The people of the protesters are starting to also get increasingly violent. Amazingly, there are no deaths yet. Uh, a dude caught fire. He's alive. A dude was stabbed. He's alive. A fellow shot by the police. He's alive. Guy got an eye injury. So one of the badges the Hong Kongers used was like a red bandana or like a red eye patch, a bandana over their eye to express solidarity with the guy who got his eye hurt. Um, so all of this has been escalating, uh, and we as a country now here's a tricky issue is that Hong Kong is part of China. You could characterize this as an internal issue for China, and you wouldn't be wrong. It's similar to with the way China has dealt with Tibet. Ask any Uyghur, by the way. We aren't. We should express solidarity with the Uyghurs, these Muslims in China who are being sort of phased out and their religion literally bulldozed. These are internal issues with China. Now, it's not like the Strait of Taiwan where we have a military commitment, but what it is uh, this is where our values as a country, where the values of any democracy should come into play, is we should support the rioters. Rioters, listen to me. I'm being like Xi, like the leader of China. We should support the protesters because they stand for the values that we stand for. Because China is a brutally repressive autocracy. We are not their friends. We do not approve of the way that they govern their people. But unfortunately, the situation with our government now, ask any Kurd, is that we are currently, our executive branch and our legislative branch, by the way, uh, are hobbled by a Republican Party that loves strongmen, that loves that loves protesters being cracked down on, that loves Turkey going into Syria and kicking the Kurds out, loves North Korea. Trump loves getting his picture taken with North Korea. So, if our government is not going to express solidarity with the protesters of Hong Kong, that then falls to us being citizens, people. Uh, if Trump won't do it, if the Republicans won't do it, and some of them might, but we as a people should express solidarity with the folks of Hong Kong because what they're asking for is what we would characterize as inalienable rights. And that word inalienable, that says it all. These people, they don't get these rights. They're not granted these rights by China. These are rights they inherently have as human beings. There's a reason it's called human rights. And what's going on in Hong Kong right now is a violation of human rights. People who were guaranteed uh, a system of government for 50 years, and what's really going on here, by the way, is China knowing what it can get away with. China seeing how incredibly weakened the United States has been with our diplomatic, with our capital, our geopolitical capital, how weak we are, how unwilling we are to stand up for values, and they're sort of nudging. They're seeing what they can get away with in Hong Kong. Uh, so anybody, any reasonable person, any rational person who appreciates the concept of inalienable rights should support the protesters of Hong Kong. And let me now show you. There was a Grandmasters Championship thing for Hearthstone, this free-to-play card game, uh, and a fella who won it named, and I'm never entirely sure how to pronounce NG. You just say ing, right? It's not Ng. Uh, so a fella named Chung Ing Wei. He goes by the name Blitz Chung, but I'd always prefer to call these people by their actual names than their goofy online names. He won. Well, I don't know. He won $10,000 and he ranked somewhere in this championship. And as befits esports, these fellas afterwards wanted to interview him, and that's part of just the whole esports scene. So here's this fella on the right. Uh, that's Chung Ing Wei on the right, and he's wearing a ski mask, not because he's going to go skiing, but because this is what the protesters in Hong Kong wear to protect their identities for one, and also to protect themselves from tear gas. They started wearing these masks. He's got a little respirator mask there. Uh, and by the way, that was another thing that in Hong Kong they outlawed masks shortly before this incident that we're going to look at right here. So Chung Ing-wei shows up for his interview wearing that little ski goggles and the back up here and the respirator mask to show solidarity with the people of Hong Kong. And those shoutcasters, that's what they call them, those little broadcasters there on the left, they were like, "What are you doing?" I mean, and I haven't seen any of the video before this right here, and it's in Chinese. I'm not going to understand it. I just read a rough translation. But they were like, what are you wearing that for? And he, at some point, I mean, it's obvious that he was expressing solidarity with the protesters in Hong Kong. So the fellows on the left told him, they basically dared him, they egged him on to say the 8 words that characterize that the Hong Kong protesters are using as a kind of a rallying cry. Let me get those for you. Right there, liberate Hong Kong, the revolution of our times. That's, and I'm sure you'll hear it in a moment. Uh, they egged him on to say this, and when he agreed to say it, they do this cute little thing, and I'm kind of being facetious here. I mean, these are kids. I shouldn't be too hard on them, but they do this little thing where they kind of know they're going to get in trouble, so they duck their heads down. They say, okay, we're going to duck our heads down so you say it, so we can kind of have plausible deniability. And then he says it, and his feed gets cut. And Blizzard, let me just show you. I mean, it's just
你
kids
就讲完
goofing
那8个
around.
字，然后导播我们就结束，我们就什么也都不要聊了，然后你随时可以开始。头先低
See,
下
he's
来。
doing the thing. Okay, we're not going to look.
光复香港，时代革命。
Those are the 8 words.
导播可以切回来了。
好，导播，谢谢。
谢谢，好，可以了。
And he's
这样可
gone.
以吧？
They're not
好
controlling, by the way, the
聪哥，
control board for the video. And they do the polite little golf
我们会
clap.
进破口吗？这访问会不会太短？我觉得这样就够了
And。they're even saying, I think they're saying, well, that was a short interview, and I think there's even some talk about did we go too far? But so these guys were fired. Chung Ing-wai was, Blizzard took away his money. They said, yeah, you know what, you didn't win anything. We're canceling your victory. And furthermore, you can't compete for a year. And they did this very quickly. And people were rightly upset. This is not the way that Blizzard should react. Like I said, every reasonable person who believes in inalienable rights should be able to say what that fella, that young kid on the right said. There's nothing wrong with what he said. That is not, what he said should not be controversial unless you feel that Chinese autocracy, that the repressive Chinese government, that a one-party communist party system in China, unless you feel that a government that can raise mosques, that will not allow its citizens freedom of speech, freedom of religion, that refuses to recognize what we consider inalienable rights, if you feel that that is a viable approach to people, then yeah, what he's saying is controversial. If you don't feel that, and nobody in the United States should feel that, nobody in the Western world, nobody who doesn't live in a theocracy or a kleptocracy, like nobody who believes in fair and just representative government should feel that what he said is controversial. So a bunch of people got angry at Blizzard, and I was one of them. I mean, that's beyond the pale for them to slap down this kid for that non-controversial statement, and it's in a relatively, they're being very playful about it. There is nothing strident about that going on there. He's obviously happy he just won. He just wants to shout out to these people that he's been thinking of. And that's not something that he should be punished for. Yet Blizzard took away his money. They said, you can't compete for a year, and they fired those 2 fellas on the left. Now, since then, Blizzard has issued this little statement here that I want to point out something that they said. Since then, Blizzard, this is the, what's his name, Brack? Who's the fellow? Let me scroll down and see if his name. Yeah, J. Allen Brack, the president of Blizzard. This is the prepared statement that came out, it's like a week or so later. Like, Blizzard clearly knew that they'd done something wrong, but it took them a while to address this. So he writes this big, long thing. And by the way, all of this is complete bullshit. And I want to tell you where you can tell that it's bullshit. First of all, for his defense, this is one of these sorry, not sorry, non-apology things. First of all, he does this little section here. He's talking about, yeah, we want people to be able to speak out. You know, they won. They should be able to speak out. So that's fun. So yeah, he should be able to talk. Here, yeah, the shoutcasters, they should also be part of this. They should be cheerleading and whipping people into excitement. Yeah, but then this right here, this was their rationale for firing them, by the way. This right here, and I just want to read this. Part of thinking globally, leading responsibly, and every voice matters, which Activision Blizzard seems to be floating as some sort of a motto, is recognizing that we have players and fans in almost every country in the world. Our goal is to help players connect in areas of commonality, like their passion for our games, and create a sense of shared community, which all sounds great so far. Now he says, J. Allen Brack says, the specific views, those 8 words, liberate Hong Kong, a revolution for our times, he says the specific views expressed by Chung Ing-wai were not a factor. He says our relationship in China had no influence on that. He says, we did what we did because we want to keep the focus on the game, as he says right here, and on the tournament to the benefit of a global audience. Presumably, I guess, includes people in Hong Kong, and that was the only consideration in the actions we took. But then here's the kicker, and here's where I know that Activision Blizzard is full of shit. If this had been an opposing viewpoint delivered, J. Allen Brack says, in the same divisive and deliberate way, we would have felt and acted the same. The opposing viewpoint is don't liberate Hong Kong. The opposing viewpoint is Hong Kong should subject itself to an extradition treaty, a unilateral extradition treaty imposed by the government of Beijing, by China. Hong Kong should not rally behind the idea of universal suffrage. Hong Kong should not, they should be able to call protesters rioters. And by the way, all of the escalation of this, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it's part of what happens in a situation like this. The police respond more violently, the protesters have to get more extreme, the police get more violent. So now, definitely, you might characterize it as riots. But J. Allen Brack seems to think that the rule that China imposes on its people, that people should support that. That whether you support that or not is divisive. And it is divisive if you consider China's rule a viable way to treat its citizens. And Activision Blizzard apparently does, because they are, this right here is the worst kind of equivalence, the worst kind of both-siderism. To say liberate Hong Kong, a revolution of our time, to support the Hong Kong protesters is the equivalent of ruling a population the way that China does. And Activision Blizzard is like, there are good people on both sides. So this whole idea, too, that they didn't do it because they were directed to, that nobody from China said, hey, Blizzard, you can't do that. Cut that guy's feed. It's even, in a way, to me, worse that that's the case. That they, of their own accord, decided we're not going to let this happen. That they have, that's apparently in their policy to not let someone support the Hong Kong protesters. Now, I want to explain to you why Blizzard feels that way. There are 1.3 billion people living in China. It's a lot of people. And half of those people, like, 600, 700 million people in China, are identified as gamers, as potential customers for Activision. It's a massive market, the largest in the world, yeah. However, access to those customers, let's just while we've got this going, let's enjoy this trailer to Hearthstone. Access to those customers is controlled by the Chinese government because China does not believe in free trade. They're a communist government, it's technically a socialist country, but the government basically runs the economy. Tencent, which is a huge, Tencent is the largest, I think, entertainment company in the world. It's enormous. It controls part of Activision, like 5% of it, and by the way, part of Ubisoft as well. Tencent, the folks who make Path of Exile, Grinding Gear, they're majority owned by Tencent. Riot, Tencent. Epic, 40% of Epic is owned by Tencent. Funcom, a third of the 29% stake in Funcom, owned by Tencent. So there's, and this, by the way, is how you do business in China. If you are not partially owned, if a Chinese company doesn't have a stake in your company, you cannot do business in China. Now, I mainly follow this sort of thing with regards to the movie industry. I'm a big fan of the movie industry, and it's fascinating to me how the movie industry has to reach these 1.3 billion people. It's a huge market. I can understand them wanting to reach it, but they have to make some compromises to reach those people. So I can understand why Activision got gun shy. But what I don't understand is the decision that they made. It was the wrong decision. If they had probably just kept quiet, and I don't know if they thought that it was going to escalate out of control, I have no idea what they were thinking. I know why they thought it, and I don't agree with it. And that is why I, as a person, am not playing Hearthstone Battlegrounds today. I don't have BattleNet installed anywhere anymore. There's no Activision Blizzard game installed anywhere in this house, and there won't be. When Diablo 4, I mean, unless Blizzard changes something, when Diablo 4 comes out in 2021, whenever, I won't be playing it unless something different happens at Blizzard. And they're getting farther and farther away from being able to address this in any reasonable way. That, I mean, they're a company. They of course want to make money, but they are also an American company. They also should be supporting American values. If they're 5% owned by Tencent, fine. Maybe 5% lip service to Chinese communism, fine. But not supporting the protesters, that to me is beyond the pale. If they're going to talk about thinking globally, if they're going to talk about leading responsibly, if they're going to have the gall to use the phrase every voice matters, which is the antithesis of Chinese ideology, then they need to toe the line to those phrases a lot better than they are right now. They did. I think they gave the guy his money back, and they reduced his penalty to 6 months. The shoutcasters too. I think they're like, okay, in 6 months you can come back. Uh, so there you go. I will not be playing Hearthstone Battlegrounds today. In case you haven't figured that out, you probably have. What I will be doing instead, this is the winner of Request Wednesday. Okay, so I've missed any chat. I apologize. If you guys are saying something, and I hope you were. Yeah, so I don't know anything about the NBA scandal because I don't know anything about the NBA. Like all of that, I don't follow. But this is in my wheelhouse. Like this is stuff that I follow. This is stuff that I care about. This is stuff that I want to talk about. So Kurzane, I don't know if you're there. Yeah. So Kurzane, if you have a runner-up, I'll live stream that on Friday. Just shoot me a PM, and that'll be the game I live stream on Friday. So what I'm going to do today is instead of live streaming. Oh my God, I didn't mean to talk for a half hour. Instead of live streaming Hearthstone Battlegrounds, to show my solidarity with the people of Hong Kong who are doing an important thing, and they're doing it at great sacrifice to themselves. I just want to read you guys an article that ran in the Washington Post yesterday. They have a reporter named Shibani Matani. It's a fun name to say. Who covers Hong Kong, and she has a profile of some of the demonstrators. And I'm just going to read this, and if you guys want to follow along, you can. If you want to bail, certainly feel free. But this is what I can do. You know, I cannot play a game, and I can read this out loud with time I would have spent live streaming. So, all right, this is the Washington Post. I don't know if yeah, the Washington Post does a great job of these videos, but I'm here to read. All right. Actually, I'm not sure I should have committed to this because I can feel my voice starting to go. We'll get through as much of it as I can. All right. The six friends, then in their early 20s, and this, by the way, gets at what I'll shut up. I'm gonna let Matani's piece speak for itself. The six friends, then in their early 20s, met on an online messaging board where they traded advice on stocks and investing. Their bond grew as they pursued careers and dreams, securing white-collar jobs, girlfriends, and wives. A decade on, they now swap notes on the most effective concoctions for Molotov cocktails. Rather than scouring Hong Kong for the best bubble tea and hot pot, they compare brands of respirators and helmets. The group's members, accountants and a legal aid among them, consider themselves foot soldiers in Hong Kong's pro-democracy protests, now in their sixth month, with tactics growing more violent among police and, in turn, among demonstrators. Clashes took another menacing turn this week. On Tuesday, fierce encounters between riot police and black-clad protesters gripped the Chinese University of Hong Kong as part of wider violence across the city. A day earlier, a protester was shot in the abdomen by police and critically injured, while a man was doused with flammable liquid and set on fire after a confrontation with pro-democracy protesters. Amid the chaos, these six young men are being pulled along the same trajectory, increasingly supporting and wielding harsher methods of dissent. Quote, "We've started to realize we need to arm ourselves. We're in a war. There is no other choice. We can't just be sitting ducks anymore," end quote, said Kelvin, a 33-year-old accountant who, like the others in the group, provided one name for fear of reprisals, official retribution. This cohort's political evolution demonstrates the breadth of anger in Hong Kong. Where previous upwellings of public fury were often led by students, the authorities now face a scenario where regular office workers with stable jobs and promising careers have been loosed on a path to radicalization. Violence has become commonplace at protests. Attacks on symbols of the state have expanded. Businesses perceived as supporting the Chinese Communist Party have been vandalized. I want to interject here. Remember what I said about if you want to do business in China, you have to have, there has to be some, the government has to have some say, no matter how small, in your business. So a lot of businesses in Hong Kong are basically Chinese owned. One of the things that the demonstrators are doing is they are labeling with spray paint, like tagging, different businesses based on whether they should be frequented. You know, can we support this business? That's one color of tag. Should we boycott it? That's another color of tag. Or are they completely in the tank with China, in which case there's yet a third color that represents, hey, trash this business. The metro in Hong Kong is privately owned, and after the protests began, I don't know if it was Xi himself, but there was some government official who observed that the metro is making it easier for the demonstrators to get around. Naturally, it is. I mean, they have, by the way, and again, they have the right to assembly. So the next day, the metro was shut down. The owners of the metro were like, okay, we're going to shut it down. We don't know if they were told to, but they certainly, it's a coincidental timing right after China pointed out that it was making things easier for the protesters. So the metro has also been a target of the protesters. All right, back to this article here. Violence has become commonplace at protests. Attacks on symbols of the state have expanded. Businesses perceived as supporting the Chinese Communist Party have been vandalized. Protesters have thrown gasoline bombs at police stations and assaulted officers. Police say they've discovered crude explosives, although no one has been hurt by these so far. Hundreds of thousands still demonstrate peacefully, despite the harder line provocateurs in their midst. Residents shelter protesters fleeing from police operations. A recent survey by a polling center at the Chinese University of Hong Kong showed that almost half of the respondents saw nothing wrong with the protesters' actions, whereas only 1.6% found that attacking the police unacceptable. Wait, what? Only 1.6%. Yeah, so basically 98.4% thought it was acceptable to attack the police. Basically say the police are out of line. As Hong Kong's government, led by Chief Executive Carrie Lam, oversees an intensifying crackdown, experts say more people will turn to violence to achieve their goals. Hong Kong's officials, quote, and their Beijing bosses have all condemned violent protests as if the moral high ground belongs to them, wrote a television host who's usually known for being pro-government. It doesn't belong to them. The moral high ground belongs to the protesters, says this television host who's usually known for his pro-government views. It doesn't, he says. The moral high ground belongs to the protesters. They were forced into using violence after Lamb ignored their peaceful voice. The six friends grew up understanding how large peaceful rallies could effect change. Some of their families, and again, this gets to what it would be like living in Hong Kong in this situation where China's waiting to pounce, to gobble you up. Some of the six friends' families participated in huge marches in 2003 that forced the Hong Kong government to shelve plans to introduce sedition laws. In 2014, when thousands occupied the streets seeking direct elections in Hong Kong, the families were among the Wo Lei Fei, which is a Chinese term for the peaceful, rational, and nonviolent protesters that formed the movement's core and who opposed radical actions. Sampson, 32, said of the 2014 protests, "In my heart, I knew the protests were useless in dealing with the Hong Kong government." He said it was becoming clear that the city's government responded only to Beijing, not to the people of Hong Kong. Sampson continues, quote, "But I continued my responsibility as a Hong Konger, and I continued to join in the protests." After 79 days, the street occupation was cleared, failing in its goal. The six friends returned to their lives and careers. But then came the call on June 9 to protest a now withdrawn government proposal to allow extraditions to mainland China. Organizers estimated that over 1 million people turned out. It was at any rate, the turnouts can vary based on sources, but it's indisputable that hundreds of thousands of people in Hong Kong have turned out. When Sampson returned home, he feared that it would be a repeat of 2014, another mass rally of marching and chanting that failed to achieve anything. So he said, quote, "I hoped that next time I could do more, not just complete a march and that's it," end quote. The next opportunity came June 12th, when thousands of protesters took to the streets around the legislative complex to disrupt a debate on that extradition bill. Several of the friends took a half day off, leaving their air-conditioned offices to deliver face masks and water to frontline protesters who built barricades to hold back riot police. Police responded with then rare force, now common, including tear gas, rubber bullets, and beanbag rounds. Kelvin said, quote, "It was our most angry day. For me, that was the turning point. Immediately, it was clear that the authorities would treat us differently than in 2014, so we had to respond differently," end quote. It wasn't until July 21st, when suspected members of organized crime gangs assaulted protesters at a subway station, that the friends started gearing up themselves. Kelvin procured knee and arm pads, a half-face respirator, and helmets. Ryan, a 28-year-old legal assistant, purchased respirators along with a hiking stick and helmets. Ryan said, quote, "I thought if that day comes again, to protect myself and my friends, I would use violence against pro-Beijing gangsters. If I don't protect myself, I may get killed," he said. His friend Sampson added, quote, I've thought about it if I were one of the victims on July 21st. If I didn't have any gear, I would have been hurt and unable to protect my friends." Jesus, look at that, using fire. Fire and water, there's something almost mythic about that. At protests, the self-described nerds enlist the help, and this is us. This would be us. These guys are us, basically. At protests, the self-described nerds enlist the help of Stephen, a 33-year-old construction worker. When masked frontline protesters dismantle metal barricades, dig out bricks, and find other ways to hold back riot police, Stephen is there with an array of tools ready to provide expert help. He buys lighter fluid and electrical oil to douse floors of subway stations. What's electrical oil? The liquids serve a dual purpose: to vandalize the subway, whose operator is seen as supporting Beijing, and to slow police who use the trains to get around on protest days, when the network is often closed to the public. Stephen sometimes gets frustrated with his bookish crew, whom he affectionately calls the, quote, suit guys. He says, I don't know if they just don't get it or they have short memories, but sometimes when I ask them to loosen a bolt or a screw, they'll drill it the opposite way and make it tighter instead. They've screwed up a lot. That's adorable. They don't know righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. Some of the team have developed their own niches. Kelvin, who's married, heads to the library to scour chemistry books for the best Molotov cocktail recipes. When the first gasoline bombs were unleashed in July, he thought the flames were small and unimpressive. He wanted to make them more effective and share his knowledge with frontline protesters. He said, nowadays you can see the huge flames and think, whoa, how amazing. Noting that, quote, it isn't an offensive tool to burn things, it's a barrier that allows our teammates to retreat. He says the aim isn't violence for violence sake, but to protect ourselves. Hong Kong government officials and their counterparts in Beijing have condemned in the harshest terms the hundreds of cases of arson, vandalism, and sporadic mob violence. On October 24th, China's top diplomat in Hong Kong likened the violence at street protests to a virus. Quote, he said, the virus knows no boundaries or limits. It's highly susceptible to being complicated by other viruses such as populism, separatism, and extremism, and developing into the tumor of terrorism. Now, if that's not an indication of how Beijing is hinting that they're going to handle this, I don't know what is. Because this is the official word from China. This is the ambassador from China. He's saying basically they're on the road to terrorism. For a global financial center with a low crime rate, the path that Hong Kong is now on is highly unusual and bucks the conventional wisdom that violent protests dampen support for social movements, sociologists say. Quote, Rob Willer, a professor of organizational behavior at Stanford, who found in the context of white nationalist rallies and anti-racist counter-rallies, he found that violent protests tend to backfire. But he says this is an extremely unusual case. It's like something exceptional is happening here. Rob Willer added that violent protests are likely to be more acceptable in settings where there's, quote, a high level of support for the cause, and where violence from the other side is seen as worse. The poll from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, mentioned earlier in the article, conducted in the early weeks of October, showed that almost 70% of respondents believe police have used excessive violence, compared with 40% who believe protesters are violent, which is getting to this idea that the protesters have more support than the police, which is one of the things that sets this apart from from white nationalist demonstrations. Benjamin Chung, a lecturer in the Department of Psychology at the University of British Columbia, who analyzed the survey out of Chinese University of Hong Kong, said there's a much stronger concern about the police's excessive use of force. In fact, there's been a small but significant shift in the direction of great public support for abandoning nonviolence as a tactic, meaning people are starting to understand a nonviolent protest will only get you so far. And that is the case. Tiananmen Square. Look at, nonviolent protests work against things like the British Empire. If Gandhi had been up against Hitler, we never would have heard of him. But there's a point where a nonviolent protest can't get the job done. And that's the kind of point you reach when you're dealing with the Chinese government. The group of friends and other more radical frontline protesters say the battles are just beginning. Protesters are adopting guerrilla-style tactics, they say, in which groups carry out destruction in their own neighborhoods and quickly return home, avoiding arrest. Hit and fade, right? Some have begun conditioning for battle by practicing sprints at the gym, taking up martial arts, and improving their throwing accuracy. Quote, if you think about Anthony Dapiran, the author of a book on Hong Kong protests, says, if you think about the psychology of the protesters engaged in this violence, we're somewhere along a continuum on the path to extremism. How far we go along that path, and how long it takes before we reach its horrifying ultimate destination, is the question. So the value of this article for me, the Hong Kong protesters are in a terrible spot. You know, these 6 guys, like I said, they're us. They're dudes in their, well, I'm not in my 30s, but they're dudes in their 30s who have regular jobs. They're nerds. They're friends, one of whom's a construction worker, the other guys work in offices. And they're having to gear up, and they're finding themselves in the middle of an escalating situation. And without world support, as long as Beijing continues to get the message that other countries will look the other way, and that is the message they're getting from the American government. But as long as they continue to get that message from people in America and companies in America, these 6 friends will continue on this horrible line to being shot by the police eventually. China is not above massacring people. And China is, I think, flexing its muscle. They're seeing how much they can get away with before the 50 years are up in 2047. And I want to support the people who don't want that to happen. So, oh my God! There you are. This has been an hour of me not live streaming Hearthstone Battlegrounds, and also, I'm sorry, not reading what you guys were saying. So, there you go. Thanks for watching. I will go back through the comments. My voice is complete. I'm losing my voice. So that is it for today. I will on Friday be live streaming whatever Kurzane, who won the drawing, would like me to live stream. So join me for that, 6 p.m. Pacific on Friday. Thank you guys for watching. I hope everyone has a good week. And I hope you'll keep this in mind if you're playing games like Hearthstone Battlegrounds or Call of Duty Modern Warfare or even Diablo 3. All right, thanks everyone. Cheers.